Good afternoon. I have the great privilege of introducing my next door neighbor, Mr. Doug Becker. First, the formal track of introduction and the bunch of bullet points that you all need to know. Doug is a published author for the Oregon Encyclopedia, vice president of the Oregon Geographic Names Board, on the board of Restore Oregon, past chair of the Forest History Society, and volunteers for the Architectural Heritage Center and other groups leading walks and programs about local history. A lot of his time right now is spent as a part-time faculty member at Portland State Mark O. Hatfield School of Government. The other track, much less bulleted, is my favorite part of Doug, and that he and his family have been my neighbors to the north for 24 years. And I never need to introduce him. All you have to do is point to the house and they go, oh, we know him. So it's by familiarity and community that I know Doug best. Doug brings stories and histories of our built homes, our neighborhoods, and our communities to life so that we can better understand where we've been. And for me, it makes me personal and very curious. And then it makes me think about where we're going as people and places in our lives and their interconnection. So Doug will introduce himself a bit more and explain some great stories about the history of East Portland. So my pleasure to welcome Doug.
Gonna get my workplace figured out here. Take me a moment. Promise not to use the gavel. I do have to hold the microphone, so I've got to also have to watch the clock. So I'll be doing both of those things. Thank you so much, Rotarians. I was telling Amy before, as I arrived, that my dad was a Paul Harris Fellow, and been to many Rotary meetings myself, and there's always a familiarity with coming to visit with Rotarians. So thank you for the invitation to join me this afternoon. Amy, thanks for that nice introduction. My goal in the next 30 minutes is to spark your imagination a little bit about this place that we think we know, called Portland, and to explore some layers of history that might feel invisible, but they're right underneath our feet. As we are here on the bank of the Willamette River. So I'm going to drive too. So I got to get all my tools together here. Thank you. I really enjoy. I have a small architectural history practice, which Amy referred to. I also in my other life, I retired from state service in 2016. I was the Oregon State Forester. I had a career with the Oregon Department of Forestry. And worked up in the Tillamook State Forest. Tillamook is my home forest. So, and now I get the privilege of teaching at PSU as well as researching. I've come to you this morning from City Archives. If you've ever had a chance to go down to City Archives, if you've never had a chance to go down to City Archives. There's just a tremendous amount of. They're very helpful. All kinds of interesting threads to pull about Portland history. So as a researcher of buildings and people and places, and I'm going to go on to the next frame, I think. Or maybe I'm not. Pointing it right at them. Whoops, let's go back one. So we're going to go back one slide here. So there's a picture here of a guy. We're going forward here. So in the picture of a guy with a plow, and you think he's got a plow. The city is actually not very far from here. I've collected some photographs that are really, got about 40 slides that we'll get through here on this, and that will there may be something that you see that looks familiar, and there may be something that no. So there's a slide just before that one. I think that for some reason that appears to be skipping a slide. That's curious. So let's go forward. So as a researcher of buildings and people and places, my ongoing lines of interest and inquiry really have to do with change. I run this blog. This is a screenshot of the blog, which you can see there. It's called alamedahistory.org. 15 years old. I've got about 300 posts, dozens of maps, hundreds of photographs, lots of stories. Done many oral history interviews with neighbors and folks, and it's just a go-to place for more depth on some of the subjects that we'll get to talk about today, and many that we don't have time to talk about today. So my basic belief on the blog and my basic belief in life is kind of what Amy has said. We have to know about the past to understand today and to really think about tomorrow. So we're going to go. I'm going to try here. I'm going to try to go on to the next slide here. We may have to help. It's not working. The next slide is a beautiful shot from Warrior Point. Maybe some of you have been up Warrior Point. There you go. So this has always been a changing landscape. I mean, that's one of the ahas for me, is this has always been a changing landscape. When you stand back far enough, if you can, beyond the arc of one human lifetime, you can begin to see the story of change recurring over and over and over again, with varying tempos and impacts. And our presence here on the landscape makes us agents of change, even if it's too hard to see, even if the change is too incremental. So I believe that knowing our history, we're going to go to the next frame. There we go. Knowing our history, this building is still there. Knowing our history makes us better able to participate in change. It builds a sense of place and a sense of context for today. It also reminds us of our responsibility to our community. Knowing our history reminds us of our responsibility to our community, and it connects us with each other. So here we are. There was a time when Amy and I were standing outside talking about old houses, and there was a gray-haired gentleman who walked up the street, and he said that he grew up in that house, and we were all connected by history, and it was pretty amazing moment, kind of a goosebumps moment here. So my plan for the next 30 minutes is to now there's that second slide that I was after. So we're going to go on. There we go. So we're going to frame the major chapters in the story of change here on the east side, and I want to start with this 1852 map. This is the first official map drawn in recorded time. In the big sweep of history, the landscape that we think of it as Northeast Portland was originally a scattered Douglas fir forest. I don't know if you can see the labels. This was drawn by a surveyor whose job was to figure out what the soil was like, what the timber was like, where the water was. This was just after the 1850 Homestead Act was passed. So people were starting to arrive in the area. Euro-American people were starting to arrive in the area. Indigenous people had died out. Many of them were died in the of disease in the 1830s. Were being gathered up and sent to. And we'll talk about that. Being sent to reservations south down the valley. This was the first map that was drawn, and so you can see Douglas fir forest. There's a band across the middle of that. It says burnt timber area, and I'm going to try if our technology will work. We'll see here if we can go forward. There, so that's, you might recognize that a little better. Okay, so this is one of my favorite maps in the world, 1852 map. So you can see the neighborhoods and where we are right now. You can see, actually, I've got a pointer, and Amy can open up my bag there, and it's in a white box. And so we are. I know we're right about here. There's the Wilson. Okay. Right. So, and I will have a couple of other slides that I'll point to. So some things to look at. So 1852. Let's go back so you can see the whole context here. Here we go. Right, 1852. You can see the Columbia River, and on the there we go. All right, so well, it doesn't show on there. How about that? Oh, okay. Well, so you can see along the top there, that's the Columbia, it says Columbia Bayou, that's the Columbia Sluice. Really great place for off-channel rearing for salmon. There was several Native American villages that were in that area. That's the area of today's Portland Airport. As we work our way back, that blob up toward the top on the left, that's actually Swan Island. Swan Island was an island, and was Portland's airport for a little while. You can also see the little grid down there at the bottom. That's Portland, 1852. And it ended up on the west side of the river. And it ended up on the west side of the river because that was the deep side. It didn't end up on the east side because you couldn't pull up a ship to load. You couldn't do commerce as well on the east side as you could on the west side. The kind of hill topo stuff that you see there on the left, that's the hills and the topography of the fourth part. And then off to the right, you can see there's a road to Sandy Boulevard, actually, it follows along that way. And there's a couple of Indian trails that are in there as well, the lead between the Willamette and the Columbia. So while this is one of the first official maps of our area, we need to keep in mind that it was drawn 60 years after the first Euro-American contact. British explorers traveling upriver. Captain George Vancouver expedition. 60 years after that, 44 years after Lewis and Clark, and it was drawn near the very beginning of the Oregon Trail years, 1850, 1852. And it was also drawn at a point of a real apocalypse for the indigenous way of life that was part of this basin for time immemorial. So just a little bit of orientation about deep history. And remember, we've been out here on this with our grid of gray infrastructure for about 115 years. And there are 10,000 years of history of people living in this area. So that's just a little bit of context to humble ourselves as we should. What we call Portland, let's go forward here. What we call Portland today is in Multnomah County are the traditional lands of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, and other family bands and tribes who made their homes along the Columbia and the Willamette rivers. This is a photograph out of Blue Lake. This is in the Chacoli village site that was there. And so as we begin, it's important, I think, to acknowledge the ancestors and the original stewards of this place, and to recognize that we're able to be here today because of the sacrifices that were forced upon them. Their lands became our neighborhoods. And as Portland rose, their 10,000 years of life here mostly disappeared from view. They are still here. Portland has one of the largest populations of indigenous people in North America found. So how about that? Prior to contact with Europeans, the Portland Basin held the greatest concentration of indigenous people in the Northwest. Estimates suggest as many as 10,000 people lived along the Columbia, and that kind of, we'll call it the kind of Columbia Basin, the Willamette Basin. Lewis and Clark called it Wapato Valley, basically from the Sandy River Delta to the Lewis River. And that 29 villages kind of along that stretch of river on the Columbia, a distance of about 34 river miles. So if you were out on the water on the Columbia at night in 1750, we were seeing a lot of fires along the way because there was a lot of people who lived along the rivers. The fur trade, the people who were here because this stretch of river, the Columbia off to our north, was abundantly rich. All those braided channels and those ponds, the islands, the backwaters of what were referred to as the Columbia Bayou produced an amazing variety of plants and fish and wildlife. And these were a canoe people. And this was a canoe place. Portland was a canoe place because these waters meant well. The fur trade that boomed after Lewis and Clark's early explorations also brought disease. There was a malaria epidemic in the early 1830s, and it devastated the people in the villages along the Willamette and Columbia, killing 90% of the population. Waves of Euro-Americans began arriving from the east in the 1840s and 1850s. Up until 1846, this was disputed territory. It took the Oregon Treaty of 1856 to basically settle the claim to this land. We could have been part of Canada. We were on our way to being part of Canada, but for the Astor company in Astoria. And so a few remaining indigenous people were being kind of gathered on reservations, and those policies took the land from those folks and put the landscape on a pathway to farming and to resource extraction, eventually development to house the rapidly growing population of newcomers who were arriving. So this is what change looked like. This is 1860. About 212 settlers claimed essentially every available acre of Portland city limits and established a few rough roads. So in that short time between the Homestead Act of 1850 and 1860, the Portland was pretty well, the homesteads had pretty well been claimed. And of course, those were divided up in pieces over time. We'll get to that in a minute. But every piece of property that's out there today, virtually every piece of property out there today, traces its history back to one of the original homesteaders. And all of these forces gave way to a connected series of settlements. This is a map that shows Portland and Linton and East Portland, and Milwaukee, and if you had a kind of a spot where you could get on and off the river with a ship, you had a community that was ready to happen. The railroad arrived in 1882. That changed everything, connecting the region to a wider world. And in 1891, three of the area's largest towns, Portland, East Portland, and Albina, became the city of Portland. So before 1891, I noticed that I was down in city archives an hour ago looking at building permits. If you filed a building permit, you were filing it with East Portland, the city of East Portland, in 1889. And 1891 was the city of Portland. And they became one city because the population numbers in Seattle were larger. And there was a bragging war going on between Seattle and Portland. And so the Portland boosters got together and decided they could actually be larger than Seattle if they would amalgamate their three cities. And they did. There was also issues of mail delivery and all of the kind of logistics that you could think of. It made sense to kind of finally say, let's turn this into one city. So here's a look. This is the Bancroft panorama. This is about, let's see, this is 1879. This is just before the rail line arrived. The little squiggle that you see on this is from the west side looking east, about from HSU is the little squiggle on the left there is Balch Creek, and a big stand of trees on the other side of the river that's kind of going up the Banfield, Sullivan's Gulch. We'll zoom in a little bit more here and get a detailed view. It's kind of hard to see from where you're sitting, but that is the mouth of Sullivan's Gulch, where the Banfield comes out, and where we are right now is on the far left-hand side. In that little grid, that's where we are right now. You can see Mount Tabor off to the right and the mid-ground, and Rocky Butte off in the far distance. And that is either Mount Adams or it's probably Mount Adams. So depending on what you look for this, so anyway, 1879. Here's another way to look at it. This is on the opposite side of the river. And I didn't know how large these images were going to be in the room, and this is really a neat image. We're actually over Holiday, over the Lloyd Center. We're looking toward the west side there, and that little park. There's a little. I'm going to walk over here and show you. This is Holiday Park, and it is still there. And there's that's the rail line that went down the bottom of the Sullivan's Gulch, which became the Banfield Freeway. So you can also see this was developed for Holiday Edition property, and it kind of puts the Holiday Edition at the center of the universe, as you would expect that they would do that. And just another kind of a zoomed in view here. The little red arrow shows the homestead of Timothy and Margaret Sullivan, which is about 19th, and it's just about at 19th where the Banfield swings through there. And you can see Holiday Park again. And then I put a little inset photograph in there so you could kind of get a picture. You can see the Rose Garden Moda Center down there on the right. It would be in the upper right hand corner of the map is where we are right now. So this was a very different place at that point. So this is 1897. This is the USGS Quad, and in the 80s and the 90s, as population began to take off a little bit, developers were looking to build subdivisions and housing. And that's when the East Side really began to develop. Real estate speculators bought property. You can see things starting to spread out a little bit there. They were buying property from homesteaders, and they drew up subdivision plans. And dairies, orchards, small farms, wolves were reported out at 33rd and Fremont. But closer to the river, there you can see neighborhoods are starting to arrive closer to the river on the east side, and you can see the downtown grid there on the west side. But you probably know what changed everything for Portland. It was the summer of 1905. Hopefully you know about the Wilson Park Centennial Expedition that put Portland on the map in a period of about 4.5 months. About 1.5 million people came to Portland. And a lot of them felt like what they saw and decided that they would stay. And about 500,000 of those people were from outside the Pacific Northwest. And so the area began to get more populated. This is an interesting advertisement that purports to show the relationship between demand and supply, or at least demand and price. You can see the millions of people that are crowding to come into Portland on the left, and you can see what that's doing to our real estate prices. It's driving them higher and higher and higher. So you better buy now. That's essentially what this is saying. This is Rose City Park. Every developer who develops different neighborhoods, they all have these amazing ads in the Oregonian and the Oregon Herald that were it's just the boosterism of the day to kind of look at the way advertising was kind of encouraging people to buy, and the language that was there. About here, you can see population is pouring into Portland. So now is a good time for you to buy that house in Rose City Park for $950. This is 1909 from the Oregonian in 1909. Yeah. Right. So real estate speculation and the next wave of change from open lands to a grid of streets swept across the east side. All of the fresh transportation connections by rail and by water that Portland had, the population, the real estate boom completely transformed what had been a lightly settled working rural landscape, and one that had been defined by agriculture, farming, dairy, orchards, to the grid of streets and the houses that we know today. These are 2 houses that were built in the Irvington area. So not far from where we are right now was this stately big house. Not unlike many other houses built in the same area around Holidays Edition, around Lloyd Center. This was built in 1910, cost $20,000 to build. Like many other large single family homes before Lloyd Center was developed, some of them were converted during World War II to apartments, housing, because housing was such a pinch during that time when Portland was bursting at the seams. And then it was demolished in the mid-1970s, like many other houses, to make way for the Holiday Park Plaza and for Lloyd Center. So they came and they went. And one of the ways that really was fundamental to all of the development of Portland's East Side neighborhoods was the streetcar. It literally paved the way for the development of our East Side neighborhoods. This is a photograph from 29th and Mason, right behind where Amy and I live, looking north. And from this place in 1910, you could pretty much hit any neighborhood around town. You could get a connection to Salem. You could make a connection to Estacada. Other Willamette Valley cities. Some of the elders that I've spoken with would ride the streetcar just for fun. Why not? As kids, they'd crisscross Portland from their home neighborhood. And it may be hard to see in this image from where you are sitting, but there's a little porch you can see off to the right of the streetcar, and it says Alameda Land Company. And the way it worked, at least in Alameda and many subdivisions, is you would get off the streetcar, and there was the land office for the company that was running the subdivision, and there would be some Sharpie salespeople there that would meet you, and you could look at a map of lots. You could look at a demo house. The house that I live in on Block 23 was, I think it was one of the first built on the subdivision there, and I think it was used as a demo house. Many houses, many subdivisions had that. And then you buy the lot, and then you go find an architect, or you find a builder, or maybe the salesman would help you with that. But again, fundamental to this really was the streetcar. Wherever it went, so did development. And initially, coming up the hill to 29th and Mason, which was the end of the Broadway streetcar line, up until this is 1912, 1913. I have a photograph from the same spot, and it looks like it's out in a wilderness. It's just mud and trees, and that's how it all started out. The impact on the shape and feel of the neighborhood really can't be on neighborhoods, really can't be overstated. Here's 16th in Alberta, and I want you to look at one thing here. Where are the cars? I dare you to go to 16th in Alberta and take a picture looking east and find no cars today. It's not going to happen. So in 1910, statewide, there were, just over 10,000 registered automobiles. And in about 10 years later, it had gone to 256,000 automobiles. So in that time period, in the teens, the early teens, if you were going to get around Portland, you were riding the streetcar. And the streetcar was really key. The 1913 edition of the Oregonian was reporting about the Alberta streetcar line and said, this line runs double cars in order to take care of the traffic. And even then, the cars morning and evening are overcrowded. And so we really can't fully appreciate the degree to which streetcars defined our East Side neighborhoods, but they surely did. The Broadway Bridge was opened in 1913, and I think of that as kind of an inflection point when for the car, and cars were starting to, more and more cars were coming along, and that's when all kinds of things changed. The placement of garages, the presence of alleys, things that were related to the car, really changed the way our neighborhoods were shaped. So a little farther south from Alberta is the Broadway streetcar line. It has similar influence. We did a circuit. This is a map from the 40s that you can see the BW, the Broadway line going up to 24th, and it would go up to Fremont. And if it was this time of day, it would not go up the hill to 29th and Mason. It would basically just do a tripper, they called it. It would go to turn left on Fremont, and then it would turn left on 22nd, and then it would go back on 22nd to Broadway. And again, that the role of the streetcar was important, and they lasted until the Broadway streetcar was taken up in September 1949. That was one of the last streetcar lines that left. So during this time, people kept arriving from all over. And if you look at the census documents from 1920 and 1930, in the census, there's a column that says place of birth. And it's when you look at place of birth, Oregon, it's pretty much just kids because everybody was from somewhere else. Parents were from Midwest states, grandparents, some from the East Coast, immigrants from European immigrants primarily, from Canada as well. It also showed in that time between 1920 and 1930, it also showed just how many of our homes, particularly in 1930, housed a boarder or two or a relative. We would call that a long-term rental in today's parlance. But that was basically people taking care of their families and taking care of themselves. And the first wave of people who came to Portland and people who were living here were overwhelmingly white, owing to the demographics of the day. But also in many neighborhoods, owing to deed restrictions that were placed by developers that prohibited anybody except white people from living in certain neighborhoods. From 1909 until 1923, if you were a person of color, unless you worked in one of the houses in one of the restricted neighborhoods, you were persona non grata. End of story. And this is real hard for us to understand today and to think about it, but it's something that we must not forget. This is the heart of the vibrant African-American community in Albina. It was rich with culture and community and commerce. And in the post-war period, after the community of Vanport flooded, Black Portlanders also moved to other Northeast neighborhoods, Boise Elliott, Humboldt, King. And during the New Deal of the Great Depression, maybe you've heard of redlining, the Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation, HOLC. They mapped many U.S. cities and developed a tool for banks and for loan programs to assess so-called creditworthiness of properties. And neighborhoods that were redlined, you can see them here on the map, were deemed to be too risky to insure home mortgages. And the upshot was that if you lived in one of these areas or you wanted to buy property in a redlined area, it was impossible to access mortgage financing and become a homeowner because the lender was looking at the HOLC map and saying, this is a bad bet, this is a bad investment, certainly not going to loan to you. And so they essentially directed both public and private capital away from African-American and immigrant families. Parts of Sabin were known as Little Russia, and it was a red-line area. And there was quite a few Russian Jewish immigrants that lived in Sabin, and they were not getting loans either as part of redlining. And because homeownership was is arguably the most significant means of building wealth across generations. These redlining practices have an impact 8 decades on, and have long-term effects in creating wealth and inequalities that we still see today. So I think of redlining as kind of an official form of discrimination, but there were less official forms as well. I did a program 2 years back, and I had a couple of guys come up to me afterwards, and these are guys who were in their 70s, a little bit older than me, and they grew up on our street where Amy and I live on Northeast 30th, and they wanted to talk to me about their memory of families on the block getting together and buying a house out from underneath an African American family that was wanting to buy Amy's house. The neighbors on the block got wind of that, and they got together and they pooled their money. And what these boys were remembering, these 75-year-old boys that were confessing in the way they were confiding to me, they wanted me to tell the story, was that they remembered envelopes of money going back and forth across the street as the families worked to pay off the mortgage from the house over 10 or 15 years. And so we think about official forms of discrimination, but there was less official, and that blatant racism and discrimination shaped the life experience for African American Portlanders, as well as many immigrant groups who weren't who seemed different from mainstream white Portland. In the 1950s, when an African American church community was trying to buy a new building in the Vernon neighborhood, got together and opposed the move. They took a petition out to the city that really was not standing for there to be a petition, but they petitioned against the sale. And it was so hot that the realtor who handled the sale actually abandoned the transaction under pressure from the neighbors. So that's part of our legacy as well. We won't hear about change. This is an article from 1952, and I've written quite a bit about this moment in our neighborhood's life. So, okay, so we're in the home stretch here, and I want to tell you a little bit about. I think we're in the home stretch. I may need this to get into the home stretch. Okay, there we go. All right, I want to tell you about a variety of local businesses that supported these early neighborhoods, and then I'll close with a story about change on Northeast Broadway, which I think will be interesting for you. So I've gone back through city directories of the late 1920s and 1930s, and I count 208 businesses along Alberta Street between MLK and 33rd. So you can visualize that on the map. MLK to 33rd on Alberta, 208 businesses. And I just did a little organizing to see, well, what were they? And I thought you'd be interested to know this. This is descending order by type. 15 grocery stores, 15 grocery stores between MLK and 33rd. 15 grocery stores, 9 beauty shops or barbers, 7 shoe repair shops, 7 tailors or sewing shops, 4 butchers, 4 bakers, 4 pharmacies, 4 filling stations, 4 variety stores, 4 sweet shops, 3 hardware shops. I could use one of those hardware shops. I could find hardware in our neighborhood. So 3 auto repair garages, 3 dentists, 3 furniture stores, there were 2 doctors. And I just think that's just an amazing perspective for you. There was a radio repair shop. There was an ice dispensary, hardware stores. That's the sign of the times from the 1920s and 30s. The proprietors of many of these businesses, including Mr. Carlo here, were immigrants. And later, many of these storefronts became African American businesses as well. So, whenever I drive, when I'm out and about and thinking about the role of mom and pop shops and really shaping the neighborhoods that we think we know today. Yeah. So we're going to look at Broadway here, and then we'll close. Now back along Broadway, the neighborhood was flourishing and had a mix of commercial and residential. I have a series of views from 1929, looking east at a much narrower Broadway. Broadway was widened in 1930 as the city struggled with ways to provide additional volume for those cars to get from east side over to downtown. And this photo is looking east from about where Safeway is. Safeway would be about where that billboard is on the right on Broadway. You can't recognize so you can't really recognize anything there. So you can see the Broadway streetcar tracks that are leading up the middle there, and if you squint, you can actually see the streetcar itself. It's a couple blocks ahead. So there's some other views. We're going to just work our way east on Broadway. This is another view looking east. The storefronts are still there. You have and over on the left, it's kind of hard to see there, but Ziegler's fountain sign, that's Pete's Coffee. Those buildings, those kind of streetcar commercial brick buildings on the left where the cars are parked there, that building is still there. All those buildings are still there, but the street has been pretty significantly changed. I think you'll agree. Great street trees on the old Broadway as well. And it wasn't all commercial. There was quite a bit of residential, and this is a photo looking east on Broadway at 22nd. Shows just how residential the street was in the earlier years as well. And at the end of the street, if you studied this picture up close, you could see it, but it's hard to see from where you are. As we get a little bit further east, you see the steeple coming out of the trees there. That is that's Steeple Jack. That's the former Good Tidings Church at the corner of 24th and Broadway. It's going to jog. Broadway's going to jog off to the north there a little bit, and it still does. And so this is just right there at 24th and between 23rd and 24th on Broadway. And so it's interesting that it was basically the street widening was opposed by virtually everybody, but the city engineer and city council. Right, so some things don't change, right? Widening began in August of 1930 as trees were removed. They were the first to go. The trees, storefronts were cut back. But this kind of looks like a war scene, but this is actually the first day of construction. That's the corner of 24th and Broadway. And the Good Tidings Church is just off to the right. That car has just kind of gone through the chicane there as you go off, if you're headed east there. And all that wreckage is the old fronts of buildings that were cut apart really to make Broadway wider. This is about a 2-mile stretch between Northeast Grand and Northeast Sandy, and widening. The good news part for the city was that it employed 50 people in 1930. That's a big deal in 1930. That's 50 jobs. It cost about $1 million, which was a lot of money at that time. Still is a lot of money, but it was a lot of money then. Significant amount of the money was tied up in right-of-way acquisition and property damage payments that were made to individual landowners. And in many cases, costs were actually assessed back to the property owners of doing this work. And so that's like insult to injury. You don't want it and you're going to pay for it. And that project truly remade Northeast Broadway. Here's a look at, you recognize that building, and maybe you recognize that corner a little bit better now that all those darn trees aren't in the way there. And so this is a look after widening. So there. So speaking of places that were truly remade, it's tempting for me to delve into the story of Sullivan's Gulch and the rise and fall of the Lloyd Golf Course in the bottom. This is actually a look west from 21st. The trees that you see on the block off to the right are Holiday Park. And you can see Benson High School there on the left. That bottom, this is before Lloyd Golf Course developed. That's a story for another day. So we'll have to save the Sullivan's Gulch story for another time. But many places that we think we know today look a whole lot different than that's going on here. And for me, I guess the upshot here, and again back to the spark of imagination for you, is that while we think we know this place and that these are our homes, and we think these are our neighborhoods, yes they are, but these places have been known and loved and distinguished by so many other lives across the years, most of which we know absolutely nothing about. But we should wonder. We should wonder about these stories. And I think that by paying attention to the things which mark the passage of time, we remind ourselves of our own temporary nature here. That at the moment, the stewardship of these houses, these neighborhoods, these buildings, these businesses are our responsibility. But in a blink, this is going to be somebody else's story, just as it was for the generations before us. So with that, I would welcome your comments and questions, and thanks for your attention.
Raise your hand, please stand up. I'd like to ask you a question.
Please.
I noticed when you were talking, you eliminated the word neighborhood and just used the name of the neighborhood and said, these people live in Staben,
Yeah.
you know, what do you think is keeping the current media from doing that? They always use the word neighborhood, and sometimes they don't even use it. They say, well, there was a murder in Northeast Portland today. Northeast Portland is like,
yeah,
gobs of
bigger than most other cities.
right? And they never say the neighborhood. You know, when in effect, they could use the name of the neighborhood, like in Rose City Park.
Right.
You know,
Good question, and don't get me started. So, right. So, one of the things, if you look at the blog, which I invite you to look at, I write a lot about plats, because there's plats, those are subdivision plans, and then there's neighborhoods, and they are not congruent. They're two different things. And also there's like 900 plats that undergird all of Portland, and they all have some of them, like Alameda Park is called the Alameda Park Edition. It's morphed into becoming a neighborhood called Alameda. How many of those names, Lenare, Town of Wayne, I mean, there's hundreds of names that are gone, and now we have the neighborhood names, and you know, and some of those boundaries are shifting as well. So I don't know why it's hard. It may just be lack of knowledge. You know, I mean, I need to walk through the Vernon neighborhood. I've done it for a couple of years and do it again this summer. And I'm amazed at how little people know about places. And so that's why I do what I do, because I think it's up to those of us who know places to call them like we see them and bring that literacy forward. Yeah. Please.
Thank you for your presentation. I just want to make an observation. I own Elmer's Flag and Banner.
All right.
It's at 15th and Northeast Broadway.
Yeah.
And that building before it was Elmer's was a auto repair shop called the Velvet Hammer. But the building was built in 1910. And if you go up into the upper stories, they have these hand-hewn beams that are so solid. And every time I see those things, I think if there's ever a big earthquake here, this building's going to stand. This is the one that's going to survive. But looking at the pictures that you were showing, there's a streetcar line ran up and down Broadway. Well, they keep talking about putting in a new streetcar line up and down Broadway, and it just made me realize that, you know, everything old is new again. Everything new is old again. So pretty amazing.
It is. You've got a really neat building, and I'll bet that the front of your building was cut off during the Broadway widening. The front of that building was cut off. Yeah. How about that? Yeah. Please.
I didn't grow up here. We moved to Oregon in the early 90s. And the thing I've noticed is you see it so often on the east side that it's like, you know, here's a plat with a little neighborhood subdivision or something like that. But when you look at the streets, the grids, well, the streets they don't match up, or they jog to the side or something like that. Was it simply because it wasn't unified like a city, and you had all this little development now and then, and the city resulted afterwards, and it was just kind of a hodgepodge?
Good question, and good observation. So, and it's something I've written about. I love mysteries like that. Like, how did that happen? And so I'll describe one which I think is indicative. I call it the Prescott jog. And Prescott jog is a 30-30. It's like, what happened there? What happened there was the subdivision was owned by a long-time large landowner who wasn't ready to develop it, but everybody around him was ready to develop it. And it's actually on a section line, you know, sections of the one meridian, right? So, the line was adjusted over time. A, B, the guy didn't want to develop, and so the others who wanted to develop, they basically developed around him, and that ended up in creating the jog. So what we have is an example of communication breakdown, frankly, and part of that has to do with time and people when they were ready to accept the market and build out their subdivision, and some of it has to do with just bad or the lack of planning. There was a complete maze mess between not 33rd, 29th, and Stanton. And if you look at the way those plats lined up, there was alleys that were in there. It was a maze. It was not going to be feasible to develop it. And so what ended up happening there was all of the property was transferred to a trust company. They went in and this is before stuff was built there. They went in and created a whole different plat because the plat, there were so many plat misalignments. And so when you come across something like that, there may be a street that was vacated. You can see where the curb used to go, or it may just be an example of a miscommunication or different readiness to access the market, to build out subdivision.
Thank you very much.